The rain began before she understood her marriage was over. It struck the glass walls of the Gold Coast penthouse in hard, slanted lines, turning the city into a blur of white light and water. Nia Bennett stood barefoot on imported marble, one hand resting on the curve of her 7-month pregnant body, while her husband erased her life with the calm precision he usually reserved for closing million-dollar deals. Ethan Caldwell did not shout. He did not tremble. He simply slid a thin envelope across the table and said, "Sign it tonight. The transfer is already scheduled." Behind him, his mother watched with the cold approval of someone who had waited years for this moment. And next to the bar, a young blonde woman lifted a champagne glass as if she were attending a private show. In that instant, with thunder rolling over Lake Michigan and the smart home system denying Nia access to her own door, her own accounts, her own name on the screen, she realized this was not an argument. It was an execution. If you've ever seen a woman underestimated in the very room she helped build, stay with this story and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Your support, your likes, and your follows quietly help stories like Nia's reach the people who need them most. Ethan spoke in the language of efficiency. The settlement was generous, he said. The penthouse was legally his. The firm could not be associated with a complicated domestic situation. Each sentence landed like a signature on a document she had never agreed to draft. Nia tasted metal at the back of her throat, the same taste she knew from trauma nights in the emergency room when blood loss came faster than anyone expected. She had saved strangers with her hands inside their bodies while machines screamed for time. Now she stood in a designer dress, dismissed from her own life by a man who once traced her surgical scars as if they were medals. Her phone buzzed. Access revoked. The elevator panel outside the apartment no longer recognized her face. Even the shared calendar vanished, years of anniversaries and on-call shifts dissolving into a blank white screen. Ethan's mother stepped forward then, voice smooth and almost kind, telling Nia it was better for everyone this way, that stress was bad for the baby. The girl by the bar laughed softly, the sound bright and careless, as though she had already moved into the space Nia was still standing in. Another contraction tightened low in Nia's abdomen, sharp enough to steal her breath. She pressed her palm against the table to steady herself and looked at Ethan. Not with pleading, not with anger, but with the steady, clinical focus she used when a patient's vital signs began to fall. He mistook that silence for surrender. He always had. What he did not see, what none of them understood as lightning fractured the sky behind her, was that he had just triggered a chain of consequences buried in a document he had never bothered to read. A clause written in the quiet margins of their marriage, waiting for the night he would try to erase her. The storm had thickened into something almost architectural by the time the elevator rejected her a second time. Sheets of rain wrapped the building in a trembling curtain, and the wind drove against the glass like a living thing that wanted in. Nia stepped into the service corridor because it was the only route the system had not yet learned to deny her. Her reflection followed her in the stainless steel panels, barefoot, hair loosened by humidity, one hand braced beneath the weight of the child who shifted restlessly inside her, as if he too understood that the ground beneath them had vanished. Another contraction came, harder now, rising from her spine and closing around her ribs. She measured it automatically, counting in the disciplined rhythm of an emergency physician. Too early, too fast, stress-induced. Her body was translating betrayal into biology. The service exit opened onto an alley where rainwater ran like a narrow river between the buildings. Chicago's skyline had dissolved into a white roar. The doorman who used to greet her by name did not look up. Someone had already told him she no longer belonged to the resident registry. The realization did not break her. It clarified something. She was outside, but she was still standing. Halfway to the street, her vision blurred. Not from tears, her body was conserving everything now, But from the sudden drop in blood pressure, she recognized with professional dread. She reached for the brick wall, cool and solid, and for the first time since Ethan had slid the envelope across the table, fear arrived not for herself, but for the life she carried. Headlights cut through the rain and stopped too close. A car door opened. An umbrella appeared above her, held by a hand that did not tremble. "You're a doctor," the woman said, not as a question, but as a precise observation. Her voice carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to rooms where decisions altered destinies. She was tall, silver-haired, her posture straight despite her years, her eyes sharp behind rain-dotted lenses. "And you're in labor earlier than you expected." Nia tried to answer, but the contraction stole language from her. The woman did not wait. She moved with a swiftness that felt almost judicial, as if issuing a ruling against the storm itself. One arm steadied Nia, the other opened the back door of the car. Inside, the air was warm, the leather seats smelling faintly of old books in cedar. "I'm Lillian Harper," she said once they were moving, the windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the downpour. "Retired federal judge. I live on the 12th floor. And before you ask, yes, I saw what happened upstairs." There was no pity in her tone, only recognition. Nia leaned back, her breath coming in controlled intervals. Between contractions, she caught fragments of the city. Traffic stalled under red lights. Pedestrians huddled in doorways. The lake a black expanse swallowing the horizon. Her phone lay dark in her lap, stripped of its permissions. But for the first time that night, she felt something return that Ethan had not thought to remove. "Witness," Judge Harper spoke again, more softly now. "Men who move that fast," she said, "usually believe they've closed every door." A flash of lightning illuminated the interior of the car, turning the older woman's face into something almost carved from light and shadow. They rarely read the fine print. The words settled into Nia's mind with the weight of a promise. Another contraction came, fierce and undeniable, and this time when she gripped the edge of the seat, she did not feel cast out. She felt transported, out of the architecture of her husband's control, and into a different kind of chamber, one where testimony mattered and timing could change everything. The hospital entrance rose ahead of them, glowing through the rain like a sanctuary. As the car stopped, Judge Harper reached into her bag and pulled out a folded document, the edges softened from years of careful handling. "You dropped this in the lobby months ago," she said. "I meant to return it. I think tonight is the night you'll need it." Nia recognized the paper instantly, the addendum to the prenup. The clause Ethan had skimmed past with a distracted signature, eager to get back to his calls, his deals, his assent. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault on the city. But inside the circle of light at the emergency entrance, order took over. Nurses rushed forward, doors opened, hands guided her onto a gurney. As she was wheeled inside, Nia looked back once through the rain-streaked glass. Judge Harper remained by the car, umbrella steady, watching not like a bystander but like a guardian of record, a woman who understood exactly when a life crossed from one jurisdiction into another. And in the precise, disciplined chamber of Nia's mind, where fear had tried to root itself, something else began to rise. Slow, controlled, inevitable. Not rescue, not revenge. A case. Morning in the maternity wing arrived without sunlight. It came in the form of fluorescent stillness, the soft percussion of monitors, and the distant rolling of carts that sounded like restrained thunder. Nia lay propped against white pillows, her son sleeping in the transparent bassinet beside her, his breath so light it barely moved the blanket. The storm had passed, but the city beyond the sealed windows looked rinsed and unfamiliar, as if it belonged to a life she had already stepped out of. Judge Lillian Harper entered without ceremony, carrying a leather folder instead of flowers. She closed the door with the quiet precision of someone who had spent decades controlling the emotional temperature of rooms. For a moment, she simply stood there, looking at the child, then at Nia, her gaze assessing not weakness, but endurance. "I had my clerk pull the full version," she said, placing the folder on the tray table. "Not the summary your husband's firm drafted. The original document. Yours." Nia felt a tremor move through her. Not fear, not hope, but recognition. She had written that clause during her second year of residency, in the narrow hours between surgeries and research trials, when sleep was a rumor and her hands smelled permanently of antiseptic. Ethan had been expanding his fund then, speaking in the bright, impatient language of scale. He had laughed when she insisted on adding a provision about her medical patents, calling it a cute precaution, signing it between phone calls without lifting his eyes. Judge Harper opened the folder and turned it toward her. The pages seemed ordinary at first. Dense legal phrasing, numbered paragraphs, the architecture of marriage translated into enforceable terms. But there, halfway down the page, was the section she remembered crafting with a young attorney who believed in her work more than she believed in herself at the time. In the event of marital dissolution initiated by the financial majority partner, all present and future equity derived from the medical innovation registered under Dr. Nia Bennett shall be immediately protected under independent trust, with controlling advisory seat granted to the inventor. Nia read it once, then again, slower. Her surgical AI prototype, the one she had built to reduce ER triage time, the one Ethan had dismissed as academic, the one she had nearly abandoned when hospital funding collapsed, had been licensed 6 months ago by a national health tech consortium. She had signed the preliminary documents between overnight shifts, too exhausted to understand the scale of what she was doing. Ethan had been in Singapore that week, negotiating a hospitality merger, sending her a single text. "Proud of you. Don't forget to wire the condo payment." "He triggered it himself," Judge Harper said, her voice almost gentle. "By filing first. By removing you from shared assets. By attempting financial coercion during pregnancy. The timing is devastating for him." The baby stirred, a small sound like the turning of a page. Nia reached out and touched his hand, the skin impossibly soft, and in that contact, the past rearranged itself. Every night she had stayed late at the hospital, every conference she had attended alone, every time Ethan had told her to slow down because her work didn't scale the way his did. It had scaled, just not in a way he had understood. A nurse entered briefly to check vitals, glancing at the documents with the polite indifference of someone accustomed to private dramas unfolding behind hospital curtains. When she left, the room returned to its suspended quiet. "There's more," Judge Harper said, sliding a second sheet forward. "The trust has already been notified. Your advisory seat is active as of this morning." Nia felt the shift then, not in her circumstances, not yet, but in the internal geometry of her position. Less than 12 hours ago, she had stood in a hallway stripped of access, erased by a system that recognized Ethan's authority as absolute. Now, without raising her voice, without sending a single message, she occupied a space in a structure he needed to survive. On the muted television mounted in the corner, a financial news channel ran a segment about venture capital volatility. Ethan's firm logo appeared in the lower ticker, his face in a recent interview. Confident, composed, speaking about strategic foresight. He had always believed control was a matter of speed. Move first, close fast, eliminate variables. He had never imagined a clause written in the quiet margins of a prenup would outlast all his momentum. Nia closed the folder and rested her hand on it, not possessively, but with the calm of a surgeon preparing for a long, complex procedure. There would be no dramatic announcement, no sudden confrontation. That was not how systems were rewired. "This doesn't destroy him," she said at last, her voice low, steady. Judge Harper's mouth curved in something that was not quite a smile. "No," she replied. "It gives you a position in the room when the structure around him begins to fail." In the bassinet, her son opened his eyes for the first time, dark and searching, as if trying to focus on the world he had entered in the middle of a storm. And for the first time since the envelope slid across the marble table, Nia allowed herself to imagine not survival, not escape, but strategy. Slow, precise, and public enough that when Ethan Caldwell finally understood what he had done, it would not be a private realization in a penthouse above the city. It would be a matter of record. The night her son was born, the hospital did not dim its lights for tenderness. Mercy General burned in relentless fluorescence, every corridor washed in a color that erased shadows and demanded endurance. Nia labored in a room that smelled of antiseptic and overheated machinery, the windows sealed, the city reduced to a distant scatter of white and red. Pain came in measured waves, but she met it the way she had met every crisis in the trauma bay, counting, breathing, converting fear into data. Somewhere down the hall a code was called, the sharp announcement slicing through the air. Instinct moved through her, even as another contraction took her voice. Her body was splitting itself open to bring life forward, and still her mind tracked the rhythm of the hospital, the pace of footsteps, the urgency in the intercom, the unmistakable sound of a gurney being pushed too fast. Mass casualty, one of the nurses whispered, adjusting the monitors at Nia's side. Highway pileup. They're bringing them in now. The words should have belonged to another world. A world where Nia stood gloved and steady beneath surgical lamps. But the fluorescent light above her bed was the same light that had watched her close wounds and restart failing hearts. It hummed with the same indifferent constancy. Another contraction rose, brutal and absolute. She gripped the rails and breathed through it, refusing to surrender to the chaos her body demanded. When it passed, she turned her head toward the open door. Orderlies rushed by, their scrubs marked with rain and blood. A paramedic shouted vitals, the air filled with that metallic scent she knew too well. Then she heard it, the voice of the attending in the trauma bay, tight with a strain she had never heard before. Where is Bennett? We need Bennett. For a moment, the room tilted. She was not scheduled. She was not even cleared to stand. Yet the call reached her the way a pulse reaches the fingertips. Automatic, undeniable. I'm here, she said, though no one in the doorway had asked. The nurse protested, gentle but firm, reminding her she was minutes from delivery, that her own life was balanced on a threshold. But Nia was already calculating, already shifting from patient to surgeon in the private architecture of her mind. The baby's heart rate was strong. The labor had entered its final phase. The trauma bay was losing time. They did not move her from the bed. Instead, they brought the emergency to her. Through the open doorway, she saw the gurney roll past, a man gray with shock, blood soaking through the makeshift dressings at his chest. A name was spoken, recognized instantly by everyone in the room. Daniel Mercer, founder of one of the largest health tech corporations in the country, the kind of patient whose survival altered markets. The attending looked at Nia across the corridor, hesitation warring with need. You know his research, he said. You wrote the triage protocol we're using. Her own pain surged again, blinding, but she forced herself upright, fingers gripping the edge of the bed until the wave broke. In the suspended seconds that followed, the fluorescent light seemed to sharpen, isolating her from everything but the choice in front of her. Prep a mobile field, she ordered, her voice steady in a way that silenced the room. You don't move me, you bring me the data. They wheeled in the monitor feed, the scans flickering to life on a portable screen. Nia read them the way she had read every life balance between loss and return. Quick, precise, stripping away the noise. Her body continued its ancient work, muscles tightening in a rhythm older than any hospital. But her mind moved through the algorithm she herself had designed, the surgical AI prototype mapping probabilities in the back of her memory. Clamp the descending branch, she said. Now, you're losing him on time, not volume. In the trauma bay, hands moved according to her voice. The attending repeated her instructions as if they were law. The fluorescent light reflected off the stainless steel instruments, off the sweat on the surgeons' foreheads, off the thin line of determination in Nia's eyes, as another contraction forced her to pause mid-sentence. Between one breath and the next, two lives hung in the balance. One emerging into the world beside her, one fighting not to leave it down the hall. A cry split the air first, fierce and undeniable. Her son entered the world in a rush of motion and sound, his voice cutting through the clinical brightness like something elemental and ungovernable. Nia reached for him with trembling arms, the warmth of his body against her chest anchoring her in a way nothing else could. At that same moment, a shout rose from the trauma bay, Daniel Mercer's vitals stabilizing, the monitor finding its rhythm again. For a heartbeat, the hospital held both sounds, the newborn's first declaration and the mechanical proof of a life pulled back from the edge. Later, when the corridors quieted and the fluorescent lights dimmed to their lowest setting, a representative from Mercer's company stood at the foot of her bed, speaking in the careful tone reserved for moments that would become history. He asked who made the call, the woman said. Who saved him? Nia looked down at her son, his small hand wrapped around her finger with a grip that felt impossibly strong. I was doing my job, she answered. But the story had already begun to move beyond the walls of Mercy General, carried in hushed conversations between surgeons, in a message sent to a boardroom across the city, in the recognition of a name that had been spoken in crisis and obeyed without question. Under the unyielding fluorescent light, Nia had given birth to more than a child. She had re-entered the system Ethan believed he controlled, this time in a position no one could lock out. Ethan Caldwell introduced her as if she were a concept, not a person. Just something light in a season that's been complicated. The rooftop of the Langham shimmered with curated elegance. Glass fire columns, a skyline arranged like a private constellation. Investors moving in slow, confident circles, with drinks that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Cameras drifted the way they always did around Ethan, drawn to the gravity of a man whose name opened doors. At his side stood Sloane Whitaker, the woman he had once called temporary, her hand resting on his arm with the easy ownership of someone who had never been told she did not belong. She wore silver that caught the light every time she turned her head. She knew the angles. She knew where to look when the photographers lifted their lenses. Her followers were already flooding her live stream with heart emojis and fire symbols, the comments sliding upward in a bright, relentless cascade. VC royalty, someone murmured as Ethan passed. He smiled the way he did when a deal was about to close, measured, predatory, certain. But the room did not move toward him the way it had 6 months ago. There was a hesitation now, a fraction of a second in which eyes flickered, not to his face, but to the phones in their hands. A whisper moved through the clusters of black suits and silk gowns, too soft to quote but too persistent to ignore. The divorce had been efficient, yes, clean, his PR team had insisted. Yet the image of a pregnant surgeon locked out of her own home in a thunderstorm had traveled faster than his press releases. Sloane tilted her phone toward him, her smile never breaking. Babe, they're asking if the rumors are true, she said lightly, as though discussing a change in weather. Tell them something. Ethan leaned into the frame, his voice smooth, the cadence of a man accustomed to shaping narratives. We wish everyone the best, he said. We're focused on the future. The comments did not slow. Someone in the background typed a name, Dr. Nia Bennett. It appeared once, then again, then multiplied until it filled the screen like a tide. Sloane lowered the phone, the light in her eyes sharpening for the first time that evening. They're obsessed with her, she said, not quite masking the irritation. She's a surgeon, Ethan replied, dismissive. This is a different world. Yet when he turned back to the investors gathered near the glass railing, he saw the shift. A partner from San Francisco, who used to greet him with an embrace, now offered only a polite nod. A fund manager who had been waiting for months to get into his next round excused herself mid-conversation, her attention caught by a breaking alert on her phone. On the massive digital display above the bar, the financial news loop changed segments. Daniel Mercer, still pale but upright, was giving his first interview since the accident. The headline read, "Health Tech Leader Credited with Miracle Recovery. Trauma Team Speaks." Ethan barely glanced at it until the reporter spoke a name. Sources inside Mercy General say the critical surgical call came from Dr. Nia Bennett, who, the rest of the sentence dissolved into the sudden absence of sound around him. Not silence, absence. Conversations continued, glasses clinked, laughter rose and fell, but the space immediately surrounding Ethan felt vacuum-sealed, as though the air itself had stepped back to observe. Sloane followed his gaze to the screen. For a heartbeat, her expression remained perfectly composed. Then the calculation began, visible only in the minute tightening at the corners of her mouth. "That's your ex, right?" she asked, too casually. "She's not relevant," Ethan said, but his voice had lost the effortless rhythm it usually carried. Across the terrace, two junior associates from his own firm were watching the broadcast instead of the skyline. One of them was speaking into his phone, urgent, his eyes darting toward Ethan with the quick guilt of someone caught witnessing a private unraveling. The notification came through Ethan's watch first, a discreet vibration against his wrist. Investor call moved up, immediate attendance requested. Another followed. Need clarification on exposure risk. He turned the watch face inward, as if hiding it from the night. Sloane stepped closer, her hand tightening on his arm. "We're still good, right?" she asked, and for the first time the question was not for her audience. Ethan forced a smile, the expression he had perfected in boardrooms and negotiations, the one that suggested control even when numbers shifted beneath him. "Temporary noise," he said, nothing structural, but the word hung between them with an unintended echo. Temporary. It was the word he had used when his mother asked about Nia's research, when partners questioned the hours she kept at the hospital, when Sloane herself had first appeared in his life like a bright, uncomplicated solution. Temporary. On the screen, Nia's face replaced Mercer's, an archival photo from a medical conference, her expression direct, her posture unadorned by the performance of power. Beneath it, the caption identified her as the lead architect of the Triage algorithm, now being licensed across multiple states. Someone near the bar began to clap, a reflexive gesture of admiration for a story of survival and brilliance. Others joined, not for Ethan, not for the deals he had closed, or the millions he had moved through invisible channels, but for the woman he had removed from his life with a digital command. The applause did not reach him. He stood at the center of the terrace, the skyline blazing behind him, the cameras still drifting, but their focus had shifted by degrees, too subtle to protest. Sloane lifted her phone again, angling for a better light, her voice bright as she resumed the stream. "We love a comeback story," she said to her followers, her smile flawless. Yet when she leaned into Ethan for the shot, the distance between them registered, not in inches, but in the way his body remained fractionally turned toward the screen, toward the name that refused to return to the past. For the first time since the night of the storm, he understood that what he had dismissed as an emotional complication had entered the only arena that mattered to him, visibility. And in that arena, the woman he had called temporary was not the one rewriting the narrative. The email arrived at 5:12 a.m., the hour when the hospital belonged only to the sleepless and the necessary. Nia was still in her scrubs from the night shift, her son finally asleep against her shoulder in the on-call room, his breath warm through the thin cotton of her shirt. Outside the narrow window, Chicago was a pale suggestion of itself, the lake a sheet of dull silver waiting for sunrise. She opened the message with the same detached focus she used to read lab results. Advisory seat confirmation, Helix Trauma Systems. Equity activation effective immediately. No music swelled. No one witnessed it. The world did not pause. Yet something irreversible moved into place. Helix was not just another startup chasing disruption. It was the consortium Daniel Mercer had built after surviving the accident, a national infrastructure for emergency response technology, funded by hospital networks, insurance giants, and the same venture capital circles Ethan had once navigated like a private ocean. Her algorithm, The triage sequence she had coded in exhaustion and stubborn hope was now the central architecture of its deployment. Her ownership was not symbolic, it was structural. Nia scrolled through the attached documents while rocking her son with her foot, the legal language unfolding like a map of territory she had not realized she possessed. Voting rights, revenue participation, access to strategic sessions, a permanent advisory position that could not be diluted without her consent, control that required no announcement. In the corridor, two residents argued over a chart, their voices carrying the familiar urgency of lives balanced on minutes. Nia closed the email and rose, shifting her son into the bassinet beside the narrow bed. She washed her hands at the small sink, watching the water carry away the last traces of the night, iodine, latex powder, the invisible fatigue of decisions made under pressure. Her phone buzzed again. A calendar invite. Helix Strategic Board. Closed session. Location, Chicago. Attendance required. Required, she almost smiled. The conference room overlooked the river, its walls made entirely of glass, as if transparency were a design choice instead of a legal obligation. The men and women seated around the table represented funds Ethan had spent years trying to access, names that moved markets, faces that rarely appeared in public. They turned when she entered, not with surprise, but with the precise acknowledgement given to someone whose presence had already been decided. "Dr. Bennett," Mercer said from the head of the table, his voice still carrying the slight roughness of recovery. "Your system saved my life. I prefer to build with people who understand what survival costs." There was no mention of her past, no reference to the divorce that had become a quiet headline. Here she existed only in the dimension that mattered: capacity. The screen behind them lit up with projections, national rollout timelines, licensing agreements, hospital adoption rates. Her algorithm sat at the center of every model, a quiet engine generating value with each passing quarter. "Your equity position," the chief financial officer said, tapping the tablet in front of him, "places you among our primary stakeholders." Primary, the word settled into her with a weight that was neither triumph nor relief. It was alignment. She asked questions in the language she trusted: efficiency, patient outcomes, deployment in underfunded districts. When she spoke, the room listened not out of courtesy, but because her answers altered the projections in real time. Outside, the river moved in its steady, indifferent current. Across the water, the mirrored facade of a venture capital tower caught the light. Inside that tower, on a different floor, Ethan Caldwell was negotiating for a line of credit his firm suddenly needed to stabilize a deal. He did not know that the capital source had shifted. He did not know that one of the voting members in the closed session across the river now held a decisive percentage in the fund, reviewing his request. Nia signed the final document without ceremony. The pen was heavier than it needed to be, the ink a precise black line that translated years of invisible labor into legal fact. "Welcome to the board," Mercer said. No applause followed, only the quiet exchange of files, the measured closing of laptops, the movement of people accustomed to power that did not need performance. Later, back at the hospital, Nia changed into fresh scrubs and returned to the trauma bay. A child with a fractured femur was brought in from a car accident. A woman in cardiac distress arrived minutes after. The fluorescent lights hummed above her, constant, indifferent. She worked with the same focus as always, her hands steady, her voice calm. Nothing about her outward life had altered. Yet in the architecture of the city, inside glass towers, inside financial models, inside the invisible networks that determined who remained solvent and who did not, her name had been written into a system Ethan believed he controlled. Not as a former wife, not as a story, as equity, silent, undeniable, compounding with every hour he remained unaware. The invitation arrived on heavy cream paper, the kind that suggested permanence even before it was open. The Chicago Global Health Gala, a night funding the future of emergency care. Keynote speaker, Dr. Nia Bennett. Ethan saw her name for the first time on a screen, not in a memory. He was standing in the glass conference room of his firm, the skyline fractured behind him into vertical lines of light, while an analyst scrolled through the attendee list for the gala they needed to dominate. Their next fund depended on visibility, on proximity to the health tech capital that had begun consolidating around Helix. The room smelled faintly of espresso and quiet urgency. Helix's board will be there, the analyst said. Major institutional money. If we secure even a soft commitment, Ethan stopped listening the moment the slide changed. Dr. Nia Bennett. The photograph was recent, not the archival image from the news cycle, but something sharper. Her standing at a podium, shoulders straight, expression composed in that way he used to interpret as distance and now recognized as control. He felt the smallest displacement in his chest, like an elevator dropping a single inch. "She's keynote?" he asked, and his voice carried a thinness he did not recognize as his own. "Yes," the analyst replied. "She's on Helix's advisory board. Her algorithm is the backbone of their national rollout." Backbone. The word followed him into the elevator, into the car, into the private silence of the penthouse that no longer felt like an apex, but a display unit he had not managed to sell. The ballroom at the Art Institute had been transformed into a cathedral of light. Long tables shimmered under suspended glass installations that resembled constellations. Every surface reflected money, influence, and the careful choreography of power. Ethan entered with the confidence of habit, Sloane at his side in a gown engineered for visibility. Cameras turned, names were spoken, hands extended, but the current of the room moved in a direction he had not set. At the far end of the hall, near the stage, a small cluster of people stood, not in conversation, but in orbit. Investors he had been trying to reach for months. Hospital executives who did not attend events like this without strategic reason. Daniel Mercer among them, upright now, his presence carrying the gravity of a man who had crossed into legend simply by surviving. And at the center, Nia. She wore black, unadorned, the line of the dress clean as a signature. No performance, no spectacle. Her hair was pulled back, revealing the calm architecture of her face. She was speaking to a group of donors, one hand resting lightly against the podium beside her, as if it were not a stage, but a surgical table. And she were explaining a procedure that would save lives. People were waiting to speak to her. Waiting. Ethan slowed without intending to. The room's sound altered, the way it does when a storm moves over water. Nothing louder, but everything charged. Sloane leaned closer. "This is good," she whispered. "Visibility. We'll go say hello. It'll look gracious." They crossed the floor together. The distance measured not in steps, but in the number of glances that shifted, the number of conversations that paused just long enough to register the trajectory. Nia finished her sentence and turned. For a moment there was no pass between them, no marble table, no envelope, only two people standing in the same public space, their lives having diverged into structures neither had predicted. Her eyes moved over him without haste, without the flinch he had once been able to provoke. It was the look she gave new patients in the ER, clear, assessing, already processing variables. "Ethan," she said, his name resting in the air like a neutral fact. "Dr. Bennett," he replied, formal, as if they had been introduced by a third party. Sloane extended her hand first, her smile flawless. "We've heard so much about you." Nia shook it, her grip steady, the briefest flicker of recognition passing through her gaze, the identification of a role, not a rival. "Congratulations on your recent funding round," Ethan said, defaulting to the language he trusted. "Helix is scaling quickly." "It's not scaling," Nia answered, her voice calm, carrying easily despite its softness. "It's deploying," a subtle distinction, one about profit, the other about survival. Behind her, Mercer approached, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back, in the easy gesture of professional alliance. "Ethan Caldwell," he said as though placing a face to a file. You're seeking access to our next capital cycle, I believe. Not we, you. Ethan felt it then. The reorientation of the room. The investors who had once circled him now stood at an angle that placed Nia at the center of their sightlines. Assistants moved quietly, guiding people into a queue that formed near the stage. Dr. Bennett has a full schedule before her address, one of them said politely. If you'd like a moment, we can add you to the list. Add you to the list. The phrase struck with the force of something physical. He had never waited for her before. Now he stood, the skyline of donors and executives shimmering around him, as another man stepped forward to speak with her. Then another. Sloane's hand tightened on his arm, her nails pressing through the fabric of his sleeve, but she did not speak. On the massive screen above the stage, a short film began to play. Footage of emergency rooms across the country, doctors moving in controlled urgency, patients stabilized in minutes that would once have cost them their lives. At the center of the system's interface, her name appeared. Architect, Dr. Nia Bennett. The applause rose before she even reached the podium. A standing ovation that belonged not to scandal, not to sympathy, but to impact. Ethan remained where he was, positioned just outside the rope that marked the speaker's access path. His reflection fractured in the mirrored columns. For the first time since the night he had erased her, he understood the scale of his miscalculation. He had believed power was possession. But here, in a room that recorded everything, power was recognition. And the city was watching as he waited his turn to speak to the woman he had once locked out of her own life. At 8:03 a.m., while the hospital elevators were still filling with the first wave of day staff, and the city outside was negotiating its truce with traffic, Ethan Caldwell filed for joint custody of a child he had never once held through the night. The motion was efficient, immaculate, and timed for maximum visibility. By 8:17, it was already circulating through the legal desks of 3 major firms. By 8:42, it reached a family law reporter who owed Ethan's PR team a favor. By 9 o'clock, the headline existed, carefully worded, morally framed, strategically hollow. Venture capitalist seeks active role in son's life after high-profile divorce. Nia read it on her phone in the surgical locker room, her hair still damp from a 5-minute shower taken between cases. Around her, the ordinary choreography of medicine continued, lockers opening, shoes changing, voices trading updates on patients who did not care about headlines or custody optics. She did not react immediately. That was what made the nurse beside her glance up twice, because the headline was not about fatherhood. It was about narrative control, about replacing the image of a man who had locked his pregnant wife out in a storm with the image of a man fighting for his child. He was not asking for the baby. He was asking for rehabilitation. Her attorney called before she could finish tying her hair. They filed in Cook County, he said without preamble. Emergency petition for shared parenting time. They're requesting a temporary media gag order to limit public discussion of the divorce. Of course they were. Control the story, control the optics, control the timeline. Nia closed her locker with a soft click and looked at her reflection in the narrow mirror. The fluorescent light erased softness, left only structure. What's our response window? She asked. 2 hours for the initial filing, he replied. But Nia, if we counter, it becomes public record. Everything. Everything. She thought of the hospital corridor the night she went into labor. The access denial. The insurance cancellation that had arrived in her inbox while she was already contracting. The digital removal of her name from their shared accounts. Facts. Time-stamped. Documented. Not emotion. Evidence. File at 10, she said. Full disclosure. The courthouse did not care about reputations. Its stone facade absorbed them without reaction. The steps worn smooth by decades of people arriving convinced their story was exceptional. Ethan stood at the top of those steps at 9:58. His legal team arranged around him in a formation that suggested inevitability. Cameras lingered at a respectful distance, their lenses patient. When Nia arrived, she came alone except for her attorney and the retired judge who walked beside her, not as counsel, but as witness. She wore the same unadorned black she had worn at the gala, her son's small carrier held close against her body. He slept through the flash of cameras, his face turned toward her chest, unaware that his existence had become the axis of a public argument. Inside, the air changed. The noise of the city sealed itself behind heavy doors. Proceedings reduced life to sequence and fact. Ethan's counsel spoke first, their language polished, their tone reverent toward the idea of paternal redemption. They described a father eager to participate, a man misrepresented by circumstance, a child deserving of both parents. Then Nia's attorney stood. He did not raise his voice. He placed a stack of documents on the table, each one marked with a small, precise tab. Exhibit A, he said, health insurance termination. Effective date, the night Dr. Bennett entered premature labor. A murmur moved through the room, quickly suppressed. Exhibit B, smart home access log. Timestamp, 9:14 p.m. Removal of resident authorization while Dr. Bennett was still inside the property. Another page turned. Exhibit C, financial transfer order. Settlement executed before the filing of the divorce petition. The judge's pen paused above her notes. Across the aisle, Ethan's expression did not change, but his hand tightened fractionally on the edge of the table, the knuckles whitening with the effort to maintain composure. Nia did not look at him. She watched the judge, the way she watched monitors in surgery, reading the smallest shifts for meaning. And Exhibit D, her attorney said, his voice now carrying the quiet weight of inevitability. Correspondence in which Mr. Caldwell's legal team refers to the custody filing as reputational stabilization. The phrase entered the record like a blade. For the first time since the proceedings began, the judge looked directly at Ethan, not at his counsel, at him. The room held its breath in that suspended, fluorescent stillness that belonged equally to courtrooms and operating theaters. The moment when outcomes pivoted on recognition. In the carrier, Nia's son stirred, his eyes opening briefly, dark and searching. He made a small sound and turned toward her voice when she spoke his name under her breath. The movement instinctive, absolute. A child choosing by reflex the body that had carried him through the storm. The cameras would never capture that. The headlines would never quote it. But inside the architecture of the courtroom, it altered the atmosphere more profoundly than any document. Ethan, by 10:47, he understood he had entered a record that would not belong to him. And for the first time, the narrative he had tried to reclaim was no longer moving at the speed of his decisions, but at the speed of documented truth. The first alert arrived while Ethan was speaking. He stood at the head of the conference table, one hand resting lightly on the back of a leather chair, his voice moving through projections of growth and controlled risk. The room belonged to him in the way it always had: glass walls, muted skyline, partners arranged in a semicircle of attention. Numbers glowed on the screen behind him, clean and persuasive. Then his phone vibrated. He ignored it. Discipline was part of the mythology he had built around himself. Never break rhythm, never look down. The second alert came through his watch. Credit facility. Temporary suspension pending review. The word suspension hovered in his peripheral vision like a crack in polished stone. He continued speaking. Our liquidity position remains. The third alert did not wait for permission. The chief financial officer, seated halfway down the table, shifted forward in his chair, his tablet angled away from the others, in a gesture that was meant to be discreet and failed. Ethan, he said quietly, but in the acoustics of the room it carried, we need to pause. There are silences that belong to uncertainty. This was not one of them. This was recognition. Ethan lowered the remote in his hand and turned. What is it? The CFO's voice had lost its practiced neutrality. Our primary credit line has been frozen. Compliance review triggered. Effective immediately. The screen behind them continued to cycle through optimistic projections, the upward graphs now absurd in their momentum. That's not possible, one of the partners said too quickly, but it was already happening. Across the room, two associates refreshed their dashboards in synchronized motion, the glow of their monitors reflecting in their glasses. A message pinged through the internal system, then another. The private chat that usually carried jokes and deal fragments filled with a cascade of the same phrase. Access restricted, transaction delayed, pending authorization. Ethan reached for his phone at last. His banking app did not open. He tried again, slower, as if patience could alter code. Temporary account hold. Contact your relationship manager. He dialed the number from memory. The call connected. A familiar voice answered, but the tone had shifted into the careful distance of someone reading from a script. Ethan, there's been a structural change in the oversight committee, the banker said. We're required to review all high-leverage positions before releasing further capital. We have contracts closing today, Ethan replied, his control returning in sharp, controlled edges. You don't halt movement without notice. This isn't a halt, the voice corrected gently. It's a review. The word review echoed with legal precision. Behind him, another partner stood. Our secondary lender just pulled out of the bridge round, she said, her phone still in her hand. They're citing exposure risk. Exposure. Risk. Language he had used for years now turning toward him with clinical detachment. The glass walls of the conference room reflected the scene back at him from every angle. His own face repeated, composed but fractionally paler. The partners no longer seated but moving, the choreography of confidence dissolving into calculation. Who's on the oversight committee? He asked into the phone. A pause. The Helix Capital Advisory Structure holds a decisive vote now, the banker answered. Helix. For a moment, the room narrowed to a single point, the way it did when a deal hinged on a signature. He saw again the gala, the rope line, the waiting, Naya standing beneath the stage lights as investors leaned toward her voice. Not scaling, deploying, he ended the call without goodbye. Across the table, the CFO spoke again, this time without lowering his voice. Our mortgage lender has issued a conditional notice. If the line isn't restored by end of day, the penthouse is flagged as collateral at risk. Collateral. The word landed with physical weight. Ethan moved toward the window. The city spread beneath him in the familiar geometry of power. Towers, bridges, the river cutting its controlled path. For years he had believed those lines responded to him, that capital moved the way he directed it. Now every structure looked distant, unresponsive. His watch vibrated again. Board request. Emergency session. Attend immediately. Not a suggestion. A summons. He turned back to the room. No one was looking at him for reassurance anymore. They were looking at their screens, at each other, at the exits in their own private calculations. In the space of 12 minutes, control had migrated, not disappeared, migrated, to a system he could not call, to a vote he did not hold, to a name he had once removed from a shared account with a single digital command. At Mercy General, Nia stood in the trauma bay, her hands steady inside the open architecture of a man's chest, the monitors counting out the rhythm of a life that depended on precision. She did not see the alerts. She did not watch the market tickers. Yet in the invisible network that connected hospital funding to venture capital, that connected algorithms to infrastructure, that connected advisory seats to oversight committees, her equity position registered its first external consequence. Pulse returning, the resident said, disbelief and relief breaking through his professional cadence. Nia nodded once, her focus still absolute. In the glass tower across the river, Ethan Caldwell's access card failed to open the door to the executive floor. He tried it again, slower, as if repetition could restore authority. The red light blinked with impersonal finality. Access temporarily restricted. The corridor behind him filled with the soft, unavoidable sound of people who had once waited for him, now walking past without stopping. For the first time in his adult life, the system did not recognize him. And in the fluorescent brightness of an operating room miles away, the woman he had tried to erase completed another life-saving procedure, her voice calm, her name already written into the structure that was closing around him in real time. Sloane began the live stream before she understood it was a record. The light in the penthouse had been adjusted for her skin tone. warm, forgiving, designed to turn every surface into a backdrop. She stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, where the city glittered like something she owned. Her phone angled slightly above eye level, the practiced half-smile already in place. "Hey, my loves," she said, her voice soft with curated intimacy. "I know there's been a lot of noise today, so let's talk." The comments surged instantly, a vertical river of hearts and questions and speculation. She had built her life on this, turning proximity to power into a lifestyle, turning private rooms into public mythology. She wore one of Ethan's shirts, deliberately oversized, a visual language her audience understood: belonging. Behind her, the penthouse was too quiet. No assistance, no low murmur of calls, no music, only the distant mechanical hum of a refrigerator and the faint echo of her own voice returning from the glass. "They're trying to twist things," she continued, moving closer to the camera, her eyes widening in the way that signaled vulnerability without surrender. "You know how success makes people uncomfortable. Ethan is fine. Our future is fine. And honestly, I've never been happier." A comment pinned itself to the top of the screen. "Check the court documents." She ignored it, switching angles, giving them the skyline, the illusion of elevation. Then another appeared. "Prenup clause. Google it." The words multiplied, identical, relentless. Her smile tightened by a degree so small it would have been invisible outside the lens. "Guys, don't believe everything you read," she said lightly. "You're here for me, not for—" The notification dropped across her screen, briefly blocking her own face. "Sponsorship partnership. Terminated, effective immediately." For a fraction of a second she froze, and the live stream captured it, the micro-hesitation, the recalculation behind her eyes. "What was that?" someone commented. "Why did the brand drop you? Is it true about the timeline?" Timeline. A clip appeared in the feed, reposted by an account she did not follow. It showed Nia on the hospital stage weeks earlier, speaking about maternal health during emergency medicine. The caption beneath it was simple and lethal. She was 7 months pregnant when he moved her out. The comments turned, not all at once, but with the unmistakable momentum of a verdict forming. Sloane laughed, a sound a half-second too high. "People love a victim narrative," she said, the words sharp despite the softness of her tone. "But you don't know what happens inside a marriage." Another notification. "Payment processing error. Account under review." Her brand manager's name flashed across the top of the screen. She declined the call without thinking, the movement automatic, and the audience saw that too. "Answer it," someone wrote. "This is happening live. Is he with you?" She turned the camera slightly, as if Ethan might appear from another room and restore the atmosphere by presence alone. He wasn't there. The penthouse that had once felt like a stage now looked like a set after production ended. Perfect, empty, indifferent. Her phone vibrated again, longer this time. A direct message from a major cosmetics company. "Due to reputational concerns, we are pausing all active collaborations." Pausing, a word that meant removal without argument. Her breath shortened. She stepped toward the window, needing the skyline to reassert scale, to remind her of the narrative she had been living. But the reflection in the glass showed something she had never had to confront before. Herself alone in a space she did not own. The comments shifted again, faster now, cruel in their accuracy. "You were the replacement. Temporary. She's on the board. You're on live." She swallowed, the sound audible through the microphone. "Okay," she said, her voice thinner, the performance cracking along its fault lines. "This is just a lot of misinformation at once." Her follower count began to drop. Not dramatically, not in a way that could be turned into a dramatic speech. Just a steady, visible erosion. 10.4 million to 10.3 million to 10.2 million. Each number a small, public subtraction. A new alert slid across the screen, and this time she did not move fast enough to hide it. "Lee transfer request. Primary resident verification required." The audience read it before she did. "You don't live there?" "He owns it." OMG. Her hand trembled. She shifted the camera back to her face, searching for the angle that restored control, the expression that turned crisis into content. But the story had moved beyond her. Somewhere in the flood of comments, a clip of Nia appeared again, this time in scrubs, walking through the hospital corridor, nurses parting to let her pass, her name stitched in blue above her heart. The contrast was brutal in its simplicity, function versus performance. Sloane's voice faltered. I'm going to go. I love you guys. We'll talk later. She reached for the end button, but her finger hovered, unwilling to be the one who cut the feed and admitted the loss of audience. Behind her, the lights of the city flickered on one by one as evening settled, each window containing a life that had nothing to do with hers. The live stream continued for 3 more seconds after she lowered the phone, long enough to capture her face without the practiced expression, long enough to show the moment she understood that the collapse was not happening to Ethan alone. It was happening to every structure that had held her in place, and that millions of people had just watched it in real time. The deposition took place in a room designed to erase emotion. No windows, no skyline, only a long table, a recording device with a red light already glowing, and the neutral beige of walls that had witnessed the slow dismantling of many carefully constructed lives. Ethan Caldwell arrived 10 minutes early, as he always did for anything that mattered. Punctuality had once been his way of establishing dominance. He was the first to sit, the first to open a folder, the first to define the pace. Today, the chair at the center of the table felt less like a position and more like a boundary. The court reporter adjusted her machine. The attorneys arranged their documents into precise, quiet stacks. Every movement carried the ritual gravity of a process that converted personal history into sworn fact. Nia entered last. Not late, not rushed. She carried a thin file and wore the same composure she brought into operating rooms when a patient's survival depended on decisions made without hesitation. She did not look at Ethan as she took her seat across from him. Her attention went first to the oath, to the act of raising her hand and binding her voice to the architecture of truth. The red light brightened. "State your name for the record," the opposing counsel said. Ethan James Caldwell. The formality sounded unfamiliar in his own mouth. The questions began in territory he knew how to navigate: education, professional history, the founding of his firm. He answered smoothly, the cadence returning, the language of success, his native dialect. Then the line shifted. "Mr. Caldwell," Nia's attorney said, his tone almost conversational, "did you personally review the prenuptial agreement before signing it?" A pause, small enough to seem insignificant, long enough to be captured in the transcript. "My legal team handled the review," Ethan replied. "That wasn't the question. Did you read it?" Silence moved through the room like a current. "I skimmed the relevant sections." "Which sections did you consider relevant?" The precision of the wording closed around him. "The financial disclosure, asset protection. Did you read the medical intellectual property clause on page 14? He hesitated. "No." The word entered the record with the weight of something irreversible. Across the table, Nia did not react. Her hands remained folded over the file, her expression unchanged, the stillness more powerful than any visible triumph. "Let's move to the night of March 12th, the attorney continued. "Did you authorize the termination of Dr. Bennett's health insurance coverage effective immediately upon filing for divorce?" That was a standard restructuring of shared accounts. While she was 7 months pregnant, the question did not rise in volume. It did not need to. "Yes," Ethan said, and the room seemed to contract around the admission. The court reporter's keys moved in steady, mechanical rhythm, translating his voice into permanent text. "Were you aware that termination of coverage during late-stage pregnancy creates a high-risk medical condition for both mother and child?" "I assumed she had independent coverage through the hospital." "Assumed," the attorney repeated, writing the word down. A screen at the far end of the table flickered to life. Exhibit displayed. The smart home access log. Timestamp, 9:14 p.m. Resident authority removed. Dr. Nia Bennett. Did you remove her biometric access while she was still inside the property? Ethan looked at the image, at the cold sequence of numbers and code that had once represented efficiency. Yes. Did you inform her beforehand? No. The red light on the recorder remained constant, indifferent. Each answer was not an argument. It was a timestamp, a coordinate, a point in a map that could not be redrawn. Mr. Caldwell, the attorney said, and now even the neutrality carried an edge. In an internal communication with your public relations consultant, did you refer to the custody filing as reputational stabilization? Ethan's counsel shifted. Objection to form, but the question remained suspended. Did you write those words? The seconds stretched elastic, the way they did when a monitor in the operating room flattened, and everyone waited for the first sign of recovery. Yes. The admission landed with a force that did not require reaction. No one spoke. The only sound was the soft, relentless translation of his voice into the record. Nia lifted her eyes then, not to meet his, but to look at the document now entered as evidence. In that movement was the entire distance between the night he had erased her and this room where his own language dismantled him. Final question, the attorney said. Did Dr. Bennett at any point refuse you access to your child? No. Did she ever deny you visitation? No. Did she, at any time, speak publicly against you before you filed for custody? No. The pattern was complete. The narrative he had constructed outside these walls, redemption, misunderstanding, mutual conflict, had no corresponding structure here. Only fact, only sequence, only consequence. The court reporter stopped typing. The red light went dark. Deposition concluded, she said. Chairs moved. Papers were gathered. The ritual ended. Ethan remained seated for a moment longer, the absence of motion around him louder than any confrontation. In this room, without skyline or cameras or assistance, power had reduced itself to a single, measurable element. Truth spoken under oath. Across the table, Nia closed her file and stood. She adjusted the sleeve of her jacket with the same small, precise gesture she used before entering surgery, as if preparing for the next procedure in a day that had not yet reached its most critical hour. She did not look back as she left. But the record remained. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Caldwell understood that what had been said in a room without windows would be the architecture of everything that followed. The hallway outside courtroom 4B smelled faintly of old paper and coffee that had been reheated too many times. It was a place designed for waiting, wooden benches polished by decades of restless hands, muted conversations that never quite formed sentences, the low echo of doors opening and closing on other people's turning points. Nia stood near the window at the far end, her son balanced on her hip, his small fingers tangled in the chain of her ID badge, as if it were the most fascinating object in the world. He had her eyes, dark, alert, already searching faces for meaning. At 18 months old, he did not understand custody, or filings, or reputational strategy. He understood only presence. Across the corridor, Ethan stepped out of a private conference room with his legal team. He looked different without the architecture of boardrooms and glass towers behind him. The suit was still immaculate, the posture still controlled, but something in his movement had become cautious, as if he were walking across a surface that might no longer support his weight. This was the first time he had seen his son outside of photographs and carefully negotiated visitation schedules. For a moment, he simply stopped. The boy noticed him before Nia did. Children recognized attention the way they recognized light. He turned his head, his gaze fixing on the tall figure at the other end of the hall, curiosity brightening his face. Ethan took a step forward, then another, his expression shifting into something that might have been rehearsed tenderness or might have been real. His hand lifted slightly, uncertain, as if he were approaching a delicate instrument he had never been taught to play. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice stripped of the authority it carried in every other room. Nia did not move. She did not step back. She did not step forward. She simply remained where she was, one hand resting lightly against her son's back, her presence a steady field. The child studied Ethan with the solemn concentration of someone assembling a new category. The man's face, the unfamiliar voice, the scent of a stranger's cologne carried down the hallway. Ethan crouched then, lowering himself to the boy's height, his expensive suit folding at the knees. It was a gesture cameras loved, the powerful man making himself small for a child. But there were no cameras here, only the muted hum of fluorescent lights and the distant shuffle of paperwork. "Hi," he tried again, extending his hand. The boy leaned forward slightly, drawn by motion, his fingers loosening from Nia's badge. For a heartbeat, it seemed he might reach out. Then a clerk called Nia's name from the courtroom door. "Dr. Bennett?" Her voice answered instinctively. "Here." The sound was enough. The child turned immediately, his body pivoting toward her with the absolute certainty of gravity. His hands reached for her collar, his face pressing into the familiar curve of her neck. One small arm wrapped around her, as if he had done it all his life, which he had. He did not cry. He did not hesitate. He chose. The movement was simple, unperformed, beyond persuasion. Ethan's hand remained extended in the air between them, empty. For the first time since the collapse had begun, there was no document to argue with, no narrative to reshape, no language that could reinterpret what had just happened. In the quiet corridor, the choice of a child became a verdict more final than any judge's ruling. Nia shifted her son higher on her hip, her palm resting against his back in a rhythm he knew. She looked at Ethan then, not with triumph, not with accusation, but with the calm acknowledgement of a fact that required no explanation. "This is his father," she said softly to the boy, her voice steady, giving the truth its proper place without forcing it into something it was not. The child peeked over her shoulder, his eyes meeting Ethan's for a brief, searching second. There was no fear in them, only distance. The courtroom door opened wider. The bailiff gestured. As Nia walked past, the boy's hand tightened in the fabric of her jacket, anchoring himself to the body that had carried him through the storm, through the fluorescent nights, through every hour of his existence. Ethan rose slowly, the echo of his own heartbeat loud in his ears, the hallway suddenly too narrow for the life he had once occupied so easily. Around them, people continued to wait for their own cases to be called, unaware that in the space between one name and another, a moment had occurred that would never appear in the official transcript, but would outlive every filing. Because power could command signatures. It could freeze accounts. It could rewrite headlines. But in the instinctive language of a child reaching for the only home he had ever known, there was no strategy, only truth, and the quiet, irreversible shape of belonging. The collapse did not arrive as a single event. It came as a sequence, time-stamped, undeniable, and public. Hour 1. The emergency board session convened without Ethan. His access to the executive floor had not been restored, and the assistant who met him in the lobby spoke with the careful neutrality reserved for irreversible messages. The vote had already been taken, she said. Interim leadership was necessary for stability. His title, managing partner, was now accompanied by a word that felt surgical in its precision. Suspended. Inside the conference room he had designed, his chair remained empty while his name was removed from the digital directory in real time. Hour 8. Financial news networks shifted their lower tickers. Not breaking news, not scandal, reallocation, restructuring, leadership transition. Language that made failure sound like weather. The camera cut briefly to archival footage of Ethan at a podium months earlier, speaking about long-term vision. The image dissolved into a panel of analysts discussing exposure risk and governance. His phone filled with messages that began with, "We regret," and ended with, "Moving forward without your involvement." Hour 18. The penthouse elevator opened to the sound of his own footsteps echoing back at him. The apartment was immaculate in the way a space becomes when it no longer belongs to anyone. Sloane's things were gone. No trailing dresses, no constellation of cosmetic bottles across the marble. Even the framed photographs had been removed, leaving pale rectangles on the walls like the outlines of erased history. On the kitchen counter lay a single envelope, notice of collateral review. The mortgage lender's language was polite, almost apologetic. Without the restored credit line, the property had entered accelerated evaluation. He had until the end of the week to secure alternative liquidity. He walked through the rooms as if expecting them to argue with the document. They did not. Hour 27. The first lawsuit was filed by a group of investors who had entered the last fund under his personal assurance. The claim used phrases he had once deployed against weaker partners: material misrepresentation, failure of fiduciary duty, withholding of risk exposure. His own words, repurposed. Hour 36. His mother's charity issued a statement, not in support, in separation. The organization had discovered irregularities in donation routing connected to his firm's internal accounts. They were conducting an independent audit. Her name did not appear beside his. For the first time, the network that had once amplified him began to detach itself, node by node. Hour 52. A photograph surfaced online. Sloane exiting the building with 2 suitcases and sunglasses large enough to erase half her face. The caption was simple and merciless. Rebranding. The comments did the rest. Hour 60. His personal bankers stopped answering direct calls. Communication moved to formal email, each sentence reviewed, each response delayed by compliance procedure. His remaining accounts were not frozen. They were observed. Every transaction required authorization from a committee he did not know. Hour 70. He returned to the office with a visitor badge. The security guard, who had once greeted him by name, checked the temporary credential twice before allowing him through the turnstile. The elevator did not stop at the executive level. It opened instead on a floor he had never worked from, rows of identical desks, the air carrying the low hum of people who no longer looked up when he passed. The glass wall that had once displayed his name now reflected only the corridor behind him. Hour 72. The final notification arrived without sound. Not a message, not an alert, a change in the firm's website. Leadership page updated, his photograph removed. There was no announcement, no condemnation, just absence. At Mercy General, Nia finished a 14-hour shift and stepped outside into the late afternoon light, her son asleep in the carrier against her chest. The city moved around her in its usual rhythm, sirens, buses exhaling at curbs, the river carrying its slow, indifferent current. She did not check the financial news. She did not watch the footage of Ethan leaving the building through a side entrance. Yet in the architecture of the systems she now helped govern, the reallocation of influence had already been recorded. The capital that once flowed through his decisions had found new channels, into emergency departments in underfunded neighborhoods, into mobile trauma units, into the infrastructure of survival. Power had not vanished. It had migrated. Ethan stood alone in the small apartment he had rented for the week, the walls bare, the furniture temporary in a way he had once used to describe other people's lives. On the table lay the stack of documents that now defined his position: legal notices, board resolutions, revised account terms. 72 hours, the exact span of time he had once given Nia to remove herself from the life they had built. He sat down, the silence around him complete, and for the first time since the storm, he allowed himself to understand the symmetry. Not revenge, structure. A system responding to the precise sequence he had set in motion. And across the city, under fluorescent lights that had never cared about titles or valuations, the woman he had tried to erase carried their son through the hospital corridor, her name spoken with the quiet respect reserved for those who saved lives in minutes that could not be negotiated. In 72 hours, everything that had once recognized him had learned not to. The request for the meeting did not come through lawyers. It came as a single message on a number Nia had never blocked. We need to talk. No press, no attorneys, just once. Ethan. She read it between cases, standing at the scrub sink while the surgical resident beside her recited vitals from memory. The water ran over her hands in a steady stream, warm, methodical, the ritual that separated one life from another. For a moment she watched the foam gather and disappear, the way everything unnecessary eventually did. The location he suggested was neutral, an old members' library on the north side, the kind of place where power once conducted its quiet negotiations before glass towers replaced wood and stone. It was almost empty when she arrived. Late afternoon light filtered through tall windows, settling over long tables and the spines of books no one checked out anymore. Ethan stood when she entered, not because it was strategic, because he didn't know what else to do. The change in him was not in the suit, still perfectly tailored, still chosen with care, but in the way he occupied it. The easy certainty had been replaced by something more deliberate, as if every movement had to be negotiated with gravity. "Nia," he said. She inclined her head once, taking the chair across from him. She did not remove her coat. She did not place her bag on the table. Her posture carried the same contained readiness she brought into operating rooms, a professional presence, not a personal one. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was not hostile. It was structural, like the pause before a procedure begins. "I made a series of decisions," Ethan said finally, his voice controlled but stripped of its former polish, "that I can't undo." It was not an apology. It was the closest he had ever come to naming consequence. Nia waited. "I'm not here to argue the past," he continued. "I'm here because there's still a future that involves our son, and I want to be part of it in a way that isn't mediated by court orders." The word son hung in the air, fragile and newly learned. She studied him then, not with the memory of who he had been, but with the clinical clarity of someone assessing whether a system could be stabilized. "You already are part of his future," she said. "The question is, in what capacity?" He leaned forward, hands clasped, the gesture of a man accustomed to negotiating terms. "I'll sign whatever is necessary to close the litigation. Full financial disclosure, asset restructuring. I'll step away from any public narrative that involves you. I'll issue a statement." She shook her head slightly. "This isn't about statements." The light shifted across the table, catching the thin folder she had placed between them. She opened it and turned it toward him. Inside were 3 documents. Not many, not dramatic, precise. "Full physical custody," she said, her voice calm. "You will have scheduled visitation, increasing as he chooses it, not as it benefits you." Ethan nodded once, the motion sharp. "Your remaining equity in the second fund transfers into a trust in his name," she continued. "Irrevocable, managed independently. It will not be used to rehabilitate your position." A flicker crossed his face. Not resistance, but the recognition of scale. "And the third," she said, her hand resting lightly on the final page, "is a public acknowledgement, not of the divorce, of the insurance termination, of the lockout, of the language you used in the custody filing." His breath caught, almost imperceptibly. "That will destroy what's left of my credibility," he said. "No," Nia replied. "It will establish a record." The distinction settled between them with the weight of truth. Outside, a car passed on the street, its reflection moving slowly across the high windows. Inside the library, the air remained still, as if the room itself understood the significance of what was being rewritten within it. "You don't have to do this," Ethan said after a moment, and for the first time the words carried something that was not strategy. "You've already won." Nia's expression did not change. "This isn't winning," she said. "This is structure." She thought of the hospital corridors, of the systems Helix was deploying, of the difference between power that performed and power that stabilized. "I'm not asking you to disappear from his life," she added, softer now. "I'm asking you to enter it without control, as leverage." The sentence landed deeper than any accusation. Ethan looked down at the documents, at the lines where his signature would transfer the last remnants of the world he had built into something that no longer centered him. He picked up the pen. His hand trembled once, then steadied. Signature. The sound of it was almost nothing, a brief movement of ink across paper, but it altered the architecture of everything that followed. When he finished, He did not slide the folder back. He left it where it was, as if acknowledging that ownership had changed. Nia closed the file and rose. For a moment, he thought she would leave without another word. Then she paused. "He will know who you are," she said, "not from headlines, from what you do next." It was not forgiveness. It was permission to become something other than what the record already held. She walked toward the door, her reflection passing through the tall windows, her figure merging briefly with the city beyond. Hospitals, bridges, the moving lines of a system she now helped govern. Ethan remained seated at the long table, the empty chair across from him holding the shape of a life he had once believed he controlled. On the table lay the signed documents, not a surrender, a redefinition. And in the quiet library where power had once been traded in whispers, the future of a child had been rewritten without a single raised voice. 5 years later, the hospitals that had once closed their trauma wings for lack of funding were running on a system that carried her name in its code. Not publicly, not in the way headlines once carried scandal, but in the architecture. The mobile units arrived in neighborhoods that used to measure survival in distance. Triage decisions that once took 11 minutes now took 90 seconds. Rural ERs linked to urban specialists through a network that did not ask who a patient was before deciding how fast they deserved to live. Dr. Nia Bennett walked through the National Emergency Response Command Center the way she used to walk through Mercy General. Focused, unadorned, her ID badge catching the light as screens around her mapped real-time deployments across the country. Every flashing point on the digital grid represented time returned to someone who would have lost it. "Algorithm holding at 98% efficiency," a systems engineer said as she passed. "Push the update to the south corridor," she replied without breaking stride. "Their response lag is climbing." It was not power as she had once seen it in penthouses and boardrooms. It was power that moved through lives. On the glass wall near the entrance, a magazine cover had been framed by someone else. Dr. Nia Bennett, the surgeon who rewired emergency care in America. She had not brought it there. Across the city, in a quiet co-parenting waiting room, painted in careful, neutral colors, Ethan sat with a backpack at his feet and a small, uneven stack of children's books beside him. When their son ran toward him, it was with the unguarded momentum of familiarity, not obligation. They spoke in the language they had built slowly, weekend rituals, science projects, a shared understanding that presence was something you proved. On the low table between the chairs lay the same magazine. He did not turn it over. He didn't need to, because her name no longer arrived in his life as a headline. It existed in the sirens that passed him on the street, and kept going because someone inside them had already been stabilized faster than the old system allowed. It existed in the fact that when their son talked about the future, he used the word build the way she did. That evening, Nia left the command center as the city shifted into night, the lights rising floor by floor like a second constellation. She paused at the glass doors only long enough to adjust the small hand that had slipped into hers, no longer a baby's grip, but still instinctive. They walked into the current of people together. No cameras, no announcements, no need for recognition. The storm that had once forced her into the street had become a system that carried others to safety. And if this story stayed with you, if you believe in quiet power, in rebuilding without asking for permission, in women who turn survival into structure, then let your voice be part of it. Like, share, and tell me where you're watching from. Because stories like Nia's don't just end. They open doors for someone else standing in the rain.